It's really scary.
Go there.
No, as long as we say it's hypothetical, I just want you to know. Because I heard some groans, and I'm like,
Well, I assume the groans were because you're familiar with the theory and have your feelings about its appropriateness. Anyway, for those who are less familiar with Richard A. Cohen's theory, Coming Out Straight was a book that he wrote which calls homosexuality a, quote, same-sex attachment disorder, unquote, and details his methods of sexual reorientation therapy, including his theory of the causes of same-sex attraction, which among them include divorce, death of a loved one, and race. His methods of changing sexual orientation and stories of people who have undergone his therapy supposedly successfully. Were that to pass, or were that debate to, were that to be proposed, what would be the legal and ethical and pedagogical implications of that, since the state legislature is a duly elected body which has the authority to impose certain regulations on the regions, which in turn have the ability to impose them on public institutions? Be my duty to avoid it. You want to start? Since you're looking at this as a dispassionate observer.
They eliminated our Masters of Social Work a couple of years ago, so I don't know exactly why. But I don't know as much about reparative therapy as I know about a closely analogous situation, which is creationism and evolution. But the purpose. So let me just give a brief take on that and then try and apply it to this. The purpose of science class is to teach science. And so there are boundary keepers, mostly professionals, that determine what is science and what isn't. And so you would pay attention to those people. And my understanding is, from my study, is that virtually all of them would say that creationism is not science. Now, it could be true, I suppose, because not everything that's scientific is true. But it's not science, and so if you're going to teach it, you shouldn't teach it in science class. So I guess the way I would analyze this is reparative therapy, is it a legitimate, proven therapy, number one, and my understanding is that it isn't. And then, of course, that's begging the question of whether same-sex orientation is an illness that needs to be cured, or whether it is something like race. And neither of those, I think, is a sociological question or a social work question. So where do I end up? I think it's a bad idea, but I can't quite explain why.
Which is what scares Reverend.
Listen, it's all twisted.
I would agree. If we could define social sciences more distinctly than we're able to, perhaps the question could be easier answered. But just as the creationist theory doesn't belong in the science class, I could see it very easily being discussed in a social science class as part of society. I think the one issue I would have on this is, if we're talking about people who are going after master's degrees in a particular subject, then it might be that, since this is an issue that might come up in future discussion, that they might need to be at least somewhat familiar with it, just as we might need to be familiar with a lot of different things like diseases and disorders and all kinds of things that we don't necessarily support or want, but we need to know about them. What bothers me is that the state legislature would feel such a need to specifically include this when they probably are not into curriculum development per se.
I have a very different reaction to this because I teach, not that particular source, but I teach about conversion therapy in my gay rights class. Of course I do, right? I mean, how could you teach about the history of gay rights without teaching about conversion therapy? And in general, I thought, oh, that's fine. I'll teach, if they want to teach that book, if that's the book you're supposed to teach, I'll teach that book. I wouldn't teach it the way they want me to teach it, right? And so that's a big difference. If they wanted me to teach it as if it's true and good, then I don't really want the kind of job in which a legislature can tell me how to teach a particular source, although there unfortunately are many of those jobs. Most of the teaching is that job, and I don't know how you do it. That's hard to do, but in general, I think that these kind of problems may work themselves out. That is, there is a National Organization of Social Workers. They have taken a position on conversion therapy, and it's very much against it, that it's bad science. And as a result, if you were to go and get a degree in which was identified with a pro-conversion viewpoint, most social workers were regarded as a worthless degree or an inferior degree. And so the legislature would be putting that program, if not out of business, then lower down the totem pole. So, you know, the professions are a competitive market to a certain extent. So I kind of hope that they monitor themselves. Of course, there are bad examples of this too. For many years, mainstream psychology defined homosexuality as a mental illness. And people who thought that it wasn't were excluded from mainstream psychology. So for better or worse, social scientists and psychologists regulate themselves. I'm not sure how much power a state legislature has to change that.
It seems to me that undergirding that scenario is a question, maybe it's so basic that it doesn't even need to be asked, but whether or not the rights of the LGBT community depend on whether or not sexual orientation and identity are voluntary choices or involuntary predispositions, whether you consider them unhealthy or not. If we analogize, does the analogy fit between gay rights and the struggle for racial equality, the struggle for gender equity, the struggle for the rights of the disabled, all of which involve conditions that are immutable? That seems to be a basis, not necessarily religious rights, although certainly the family into which you're born, your faith tradition, is not something that you have any voluntary control over, though once you become an adult you may be able to change that. To what degree do we have a more compelling argument for gay rights if we view being a sexual minority as not something that the individual has any choice over? There was a question to the moderator, when did you choose to be straight? I'm not sure I've decided yet. I don't want to be forced in there.
I actually think the best analogy is religious conversion. I think whether sexual identity or sexual orientation is chosen or not is wholly irrelevant. I mean, my students, I ask them, you know, when we talk about this in my 14th Amendment class and talk about discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, I said, well, you could be Catholic. I've never actually used Episcopalian, but I will next time. You could be Episcopalian or Unitarian Universalist, so what if there's discrimination against Mormons? You could just be another religion. And of course, they can't wrap their minds around that because most of them are not converts. Most of them have been raised, and whether they know it or not, Mormonism is just baked so deeply into their bones that they can't get outside it. And so, you know, the fact that there's some formal choice out there, I think, is irrelevant. What is relevant is whether we're going to treat people on the basis of a characteristic that really doesn't have anything to do with their self-worth. That is, whether someone is gay or straight doesn't say anything about